Hi, I'm Noel Kingsbury, and with my colleague Annie Guilfoyle, we run Garden Masterclass, which we started 5 years ago to do educational workshops for garden and landscape people in the British Isles.
Hello, and I'm Annie Guilfoyle. We still do live events, in-person events all over the British Isles and also into Europe, in fact. But since COVID happened globally, we now have an online program and we do webinars as well. So we are now a global garden community.
All our information-packed webinars are recorded and they're available from our website. They're pay to view, but members get a discount.
And this is a recording of our weekly public service broadcast that we like to call our Thursday Garden Chat. It goes out at 6 o'clock on a Thursday live, and that's 6 o'clock UK time. We talk to people from all over the world, designers, gardeners, horticulturalists, nursery people, botanists. And so it's always a great range of people and always very exciting.
We've got recordings here on YouTube, but masses more on our website, and our members will have access to even more. In fact, we've got hundreds of hours on our online library.
And take a look at our website and see what's coming up on our diary pages. Everything is listed in the diary, so webinars, live events, everything that we do, it's all in a chronological order, and you can click through to a link to get in more information or to buy tickets. And you may want to sign up for a monthly newsletter, our mailing list, or you might like to become a member.
We do these weekly events for free, as indeed do our speakers, but we have costs, which is why we really appreciate donations, and you can make donations from our homepage.
Well, we really hope that you enjoyed this recording, and please come back and try.
Tonight we've got Tim Richardson, whose Chelsea Fringe is also a generously international organisation. Now, Chelsea Fringe kind of explains itself to anybody who knows about the Edinburgh Fringe, and that's probably most of us. But first of all, Tim, perhaps you better introduce yourself and say kind of, who you are in the garden world.
Yeah, well, thank you very much for having me, Noel and Annie. It's great to be back on your show, if that's what we call it.
Our show and tell.
Interesting you say that, because that's the American terminology. It used to drive me around the bend, and then I thought, well, actually, I've just got to resign myself to it. I don't think anyone ever actually said it to our face so far. Show. So anyway,
well,
be the first.
As I was saying, thanks for having me on your show. And yeah, I'm a garden writer, and so I basically am a historian, and I write books on garden and landscape history. So I've written books on things like Sissinghurst and a lot on the 18th century. And I also have taught at various universities and so on. And my course on landscape history is available at Oxford University as an online course, for example. And I've done lots of journalism in the past. Was a columnist on Garden Design Journal for a number of years, for example. Wrote for the Telegraph a lot, and yeah, and then I do this this Fringe festival as well, kind of on the side, I suppose. But it's very much comes alive at this time of year, because it starts this Saturday, which is why it's so great you've got me on today. So it starts in a couple of days' time.
Wonderful.
If I just pull this off the bookshelf, actually, if anyone wants a good garden history read written in a really funky style, I really recommend. This is your magnum opus, really, isn't it, Tim?
Yeah, I think that's what I'd call my main contribution.
Yes,
I guess, is Arcadian Friends, and that's a political. I didn't intend it to be a political history of the 18th century garden when I started it, but then it rapidly became apparent that that's what it had to be, because I could see politics coming out of the pores of all those gardens. So yeah, that's the basis for that course I mentioned, that online course as well.
And Tim, you wrote a book on American gardens, didn't you?
Yeah, I wrote a book on called Great American Gardens. Yeah.
With Andrea was the photographer, is that right?
Yeah, Andrea Jones.
Mm-hmm.
And I've written a number of books for Thames and Hudson as well on contemporary landscape architecture and urban design.
Mm-hmm.
So wrote but in the early 2000s, I was writing a lot about what I'd called conceptualist landscape architecture. So a monograph on Martha Schwartz, and then a book called Avant Gardeners, which was all of these fantastic people who are doing conceptual designs, that is, work based on ideas, first and foremost. And it seems to me that all garden shows are conceptual now. They weren't then, but it has impact. That sort of came out around the time, I guess, that what you might call the naturalistic turn in landscape design internationally was coming to the fore. Obviously, it's been going for a long time, good 20 years since then, but it sort of really had entered public consciousness. And yeah, I kind of had thought that it was almost as if conceptualism and naturalistic planting were sort of vying with each other. And actually, the planting definitely won, if that was the case. But actually, conceptualism...
For very good reasons, I would say.
Well, I mean, I try not to be oppositional about it, and I've written an awful lot about that. Another book, as we're talking about this, I did call The New English Garden, and in that book I really attempted to map out how we got to where we are, particularly with planting. And there's a chapter on Keith Wiley in there, who you mentioned earlier in the context of your film and so on, and a lot on the Sheffield School. I mean, I came up with that name for them, James and Nigel, and of course Noel and various others working loosely affiliated, I suppose, some tightly affiliated and some more loosely affiliated with that school, Pete Aldorf and all the rest. So I suppose as a critic, I call myself a landscape critic and historian. So I try to be even-handed and have an interest in every strand. So I don't really try to sort of take sides and set up camps and have a habit of kind of, I think, sometimes sort of saying quite biting things about some aspects of design, which might surprise people who think I'd be more of a cheerleader. But the idea of being a cheerleader, I find absolutely, like appalling, really. So I think that's where that's coming from.
So Tim, how did you get on? How did the Fringe evolve then? I mean, what made you start the Fringe?
Well, Noel and me were doing these events at the Garden Museum at the time called Vista, and we did these, and a book came out as well called Vista, and we always did one around the time of Chelsea Flower Show at the Garden Museum, and I just struck me that maybe something like the Garden Museum could have a sort of salon des refuses, of all the things that couldn't get into Chelsea Flower Show, if you like, but then I think I was sort of thinking around that a little bit, and then on the morning of the first day of Chelsea, I woke up really early, because I always do in Chelsea weeks. I'm quite excited usually at that time of year, and I had this sort of idea, almost fully formed, for this very grandiose idea, really, of a fringe festival all the way across London. In fact, it became even more grandiose, as Noel alluded to, in that it's actually international. But at the time, I thought there could be pop-up garden installations and gardening events all the way across London, so it wasn't just confined to the Chelsea Flower Show, and they could be much more alternative and interesting and sort of out there, if you like, than what you see in the festival. And I've been a theatre critic for 23 years, and I still was doing it at that time, as well as another little thing I was doing. And so I've been up to the Edinburgh Fringe many times, and I'd performed there even as a student, and even just after being a student. So I kind of was really aware of the Edinburgh Fringe model, and I think I naturally thought about a gardening festival along those lines. It's a bit of a strange one, but anyway, so I had that sort of notion, and I slightly kept it to myself, I suppose, for a while, because I thought I can't really announce this until I've got lots of these gardens up and running. So I did start working a bit with a chap called Tony Hayward, who's a conceptual horticultural installation artist, a great collaborator of mine, as Noel has been. And but we had this idea to make a series of gardens suspended along the length of Regent Street on the Christmas tree wires. The upside down gardens, so you looked up at them and saw them suspended there. And we actually got quite a long way with that, can you believe? We had the okay from the Regent Street sort of association and all the rest of it course, it failed in the end, and the reason it couldn't happen was they couldn't contemplate closing Regent Street even at night in order to install all this. They only do that once a year for the Christmas lights, so that didn't really work. But we spent quite a long, because I thought I'd need a massive showpiece event. Of course, I now know we don't at all, because that's the Fringe has developed. We realise is showpiece events like that, which cost a lot of money, are not really what you need to make a good festival. But at the time, I thought you did. So yeah, so I kind of had a bit of a false start with that, and yeah, and in the end, just thought, well, we just have to launch this and see what happens. And we did, because we don't really commission or curate anything with the Fringe. It's a true Fringe, so anyone who has an idea can get in contact with us, and that's what's great about it, actually, because the ideas are often really left field. You know, we'd never ever think of them ourselves, and that leads to a kind of great feeling of imagination and freedom and risk. It didn't suit everyone, so some volunteers have been very uncomfortable with that and have argued that we should commission and curate so we have more control. But I think if people are involved in the Fringe are fine with being out of control. That's part of the job specification.
And so, Tim, when you first came up with the idea, when you sort of woke up and thought, this is what we're going to do, did you what was the first thing? Did you just contact people like Tony? Did you contact a handful of people? How did you gather together the sort of muster the people together to do it in the first year? What was your sort of, method of getting it off the ground?
Well, I had a meeting in the end in order to get it off the ground. We had a bit of a strange one in that the RHS, I wrote to them to explain that the Fringe was going to happen, and didn't hear anything back. And then the next thing I knew, the RHS had announced its own Chelsea Fringe. So I had to go to Chelsea Flower Show, to a meeting where they were launching it at the Chelsea Flower Show, and I basically sort of gate crashed it, really, and then ended up on the stage with all the bigwigs from the RHS, and just sort of explained that I'd already been working on this for a while and there'd been some sort of misunderstanding.
Oh God.
And I also said, look, I don't think it's appropriate for the event, like the main event, to run its own Fringe. That just seems to be, anathema. That's not at all what you do. And actually the audience who'd been invited were all like artists and things, and they all got it. And I put it to a vote to the people who were there and said, who thinks the RHS should run its own Fringe festival? And like no one put their hand up. One guy on the front row put his hand up, and they gave him the mic, and he said, I just want to say, I think it would be a really bad idea for the RHS to run its own Fringe festival like that. So slightly forced into it, really, by that, because I still really wanted to get things set up and had nothing set up at this point. All I did was go to the meeting and announce it, and then I basically emailed everyone I could think who might be sympathetic to this, and had a meeting in a gallery on Walton Street, sort of behind Harrods, because I had a friendly art curator who lent me her gallery, which was great, and we had a meeting there, and there were quite a lot of people interested, and so yeah, I formed a little committee and took it from there, I guess. Made the website and registered ourselves as a community interest company. Noel was involved then and was helping with that, and
this was back in, was it 2012 or before that?
Well, that would all have been in about 2011, 2010 actually.
Right.
The idea of the first Fringe was in 2012, so it did take me a whole year working on this idea of Regent Street. And then this weird time in 2011 when the RHS announced its own Fringe festival, and I had to commandeer the microphone from Sue Biggs.
Rugby tackle her to the ground. I'd like to see that.
Well, anybody who's ever grabbed a microphone off Sue Biggs.
No, it was a very, very stressful experience. It was terrible. And I remember before I went down to the Chelsea showground, it was on the Wednesday or Thursday of Chelsea, I thought, why am I doing this? I don't have to do this. I can just stay at home. I was just me and my bag at that time. And I just thought, well, it just really annoyed me that this happened as well. So I guess that helped as well. So I was kind of annoyed. So yeah, and actually that fire in your sort of belly does help a little bit. I mean, I have to say, though, it's not at all anti-RHS or anti-Chelsea, the Chelsea Fringe. At some of our early meetings, I think we had some quite sort of adolescent conversations, really, about it, where we had the fantasies of going into the Chelsea showground on the last day and getting the plants, which were all going to die, you know, all this complete ludicrous lie, which is still peddled every year at Chelsea, that the gardens are somehow going to be recycled and kind of replanted somewhere else. When the reality is that nearly all of it is sort of wasted and not recycled. So we had this plan to get the plants and then do a sort of procession from Chelsea through the streets from the showground through the streets of Chelsea, maybe to Trafalgar Square or something, with these plants as a kind of protest against the environmental, non-credentials of shows like this. Anyway, but then we realised that we don't need to do that. You know, we don't need to do that, like kind of behave like that towards the parent show, as it were. We really don't have to define ourselves in opposition to the show at all, because what we're doing is actually very positive. And I actually love Chelsea Flower Show, really. I'll be going next week, and I've written about it in the press for years, you know, and it's a great kind of catwalk show of high fashion. And, you know, this is a rather painful sort of metaphor, but I suppose the Chelsea Fringe is sort of street fashion, if you like, as opposed to that kind of haute couture level. So, you know, they complement each other, as a fringe festival and a main festival should.
And did the Fringe, like, every year grow larger and larger and larger? Like, can you remember how many gardens or events or participants there were in year one? And you know,
well, I was amazed. I really set myself. We never set ourselves targets, but you can't help a little bit. And in the first year, I thought I'd be delighted if we had 20, and I think we made it to just under 100 in the end in the first year.
That's amazing.
And we fluctuate, you know. So in more recent years, post-pandemic and during the pandemic, we've been around 50. That's what we will be this year. One year we had like nearly 300.
Wow.
But because we don't commission or curate, we actually never know how many events are going to be in the Fringe. We have no idea. So we have these very scary meetings in January and February where we sort of feel, oh my goodness, you know, is it even going to happen? It's possible that the Fringe just wouldn't happen if people didn't come forward. We don't manufacture the event. But that's about how many. And I mean, sometimes the year we had nearly 300 was a year that the image actually on screen at the moment is of the organisers of it, the Vienna Fringe, a couple of artists, Hannah and Anita, and they organised the Fringe in Vienna, and they had about 100 events. Wow. So that's why it swelled so much, and they did it there. That's their work there. I don't know if people can see it. But they do painting behind, and then they do the planting, or the planting, then the painting. I can't remember. Anyway, they do painting and planting in tandem with each other and put it in gallery spaces. Well, that was what they were doing then anyway.
Perhaps you could give us, I think it's time perhaps if you give us a bit of a feeling of the typical events you have. I mean, as we'll think, restricting ourselves perhaps to London, where, you know, people are going to the Chelsea Flower Show and will want a sense of, you know, what else is actually happening. I mean, the images are giving us some ideas, but perhaps you could just kind of run through some sort of typical kind of Fringe events.
Yeah, well, the great thing is that in a funny way, there isn't a typical one, because they're all very idiosyncratic. Like the one on screen there was at Fenton House. That's the Bonsai Society, who put their bonsai on those platforms in the orchard. It's a beautiful way of showing bonsai. You know, this one was of a gnome invasion in which was showing off the tree pits. I mean, that was a funny one, because we always say with the Fringe, to be in the Fringe, it has to be on topic. In other words, about plants, gardens, or landscape, or ecology more generally. It has to be legal. That's a gnome based on Gene Watson, the lead singer of Kiss, and it has to be quirky and interesting. And occasionally, you know, we never turned anything away, you know, when people come. But sometimes we have a conversation about the idea, and occasionally the idea hasn't been interesting enough. So a community garden might just want to run its normal open day, for example. And we say, no, you have to sort of theme it in some way. And that gnome one was a classic example, because the people on Ockenden Road in Islington have got these amazing tree pits with very mature trees. And they wanted to do a guided tour of the tree pits, which is kind of quite interesting, but not interesting enough. And I was on the phone to the organizer, And she said, what do you mean then? What should we do? I said, I don't know. I mean, put a load of gnomes, you know, have a gnome invasion or something. I don't know, just think up something. But she literally did exactly what I said. And I just said that off the top of my head, and made gnome invasion of all of their tree pits were covered in these painted up gnomes. And it was a whole trail where you had to go around and identify and spot all these different gnomes. And they hid them in houses and on window ledges and on roofs, all sorts of things. Anyway, that was an example. But broadly, in answer to your question, Noel, there are two main strands, I suppose. The first one is the community gardening and the guerrilla gardening based stuff. So that's for people who are activists already. And I think what the Fringe does is celebrate what they do all year round, in a way. And then the second strand is really everything else, you know, things to do with dance and poetry. I mean, not much, I don't know why I said dance first. We haven't had many dance events, but although we have. But walks, talks, workshops, anything, lectures, all that sort of thing. And often by people who are not primarily gardeners. You know, they might be artists, they might be knitters or weavers, they might be historians, they might be writers, you know, and then it's just people who've got an interest, and photographers sometimes, you know, want to show what they're doing. So yeah, I mean, there have been amazing Fringe events. I mean, what's great about them as well is that we really encourage people not to spend much money on them, to have low-fi, if you like, events, low-budget events. So one that springs to mind I really enjoyed was in a little community garden in East London, where they had a tree house, and in the tree house they made a cinema, and it was so small though, there were only like, I think 5 seats in the cinema. And they showed a film there on a proper screen. For the screening, I was one of the lucky 5 in there to watch. They had various screenings. And before the screening, a man from the British Film Institute stood up, or rather crouched, from a crouching position, gave a talk about the films we were going to watch, which were about they were early films from the 60s about the history of adventure playgrounds. They're like documentaries. They're really interesting. And there was an interval, and we came down out of the treehouse and had homemade ice cream. Then we went back up the ladder and watched the second half of it. You know, so that was a really typical, completely sort of uncommercial event, you know, because we're not funded by anything, you know, the Fringe. We're completely independent. We don't have any sponsorship. People have to pay a full amount to get. Yeah.
Sorry, so I know it's too late for this year because obviously it's about to be launched. But if people want to take part next year, what do they do? How do they get hold of you, and how do they submit ideas?
First of all, it's not too late to join.
Oh, it's not. Okay.
No. You can join in the Fringe with an event up until the last day of the Fringe. We keep registration. Right. Yeah, because we don't have a printed sort of manual, catalogue, or what you call it, right. You know, a program of events. We were online from the start. So we had events registering today.
Brilliant.
Two registered today. Unfortunately, it's not brilliant because they slightly minimise their PR potential. But every year we do get that. But a lot of events have a strong local following as well, you know. So they've already been advertised somewhere else, and then they put them in the Fringe. But yeah, it's basically chelseafringe.com. So that's where we are. And so in many ways, the festival functions, you know, you look at it, you might think it's sort of just a website. That sort of at one level is what it is. But of course, it takes an awful lot of organisation around that. And we have meetings. We had physical meetings. We had one this week at the Garden Museum with the people who are taking part this year in the Fringe. And that's really lovely. And it's really, I mean, it's really important to have not Zoom, have a physical meeting where people can come and they make connections with each other, and all kinds of interesting things have resulted from that, actually. People have a sense of participation in the festival, which is what we want, the buzz of human people. Because it's about the people. It's about the gardeners, not the gardens. You know, it's not a flower show. It has to be fun as well. We don't want to be worthy. The events have, you know, they can be worthy as well on the side, as it were. But that's not the main thing. The events have got to be interesting and amusing for you to go to.
So people go to your website, they can register their idea, and there is a joining fee, isn't there?
Yeah, I mean, for most people, it's about 40 quid. And it's for a big charity like someone like the National Trust or something, they'd have to pay 100 quid. But yeah, most of the time it's 40 quid. And if you register more than one event, all the subsequent events earn you £1 after so you can do lots of events. Yes, you go to the website. You don't register straight away. You have to email us with your idea, just so we can make sure that it's okay. And as I say, they normally are okay. I mean, we have like just really. I mean, I remember one year, the first year of the Fringe, actually, this guy emailed me. He said, "I want to do a bicycling beer garden. Does that sound okay?" I'm like, yeah, that sounds okay on email. And I didn't really hear anything. And then he sent me this amazing graphic of like Tour de France people pulling a garden on wheels. And I thought, well, okay, yeah, well, we'll see if that happens or not. Anyway, it did happen, but not exactly how he imagined it. It was like a truck. And on the truck were all of these it was pulled by a bike, it's true. And on the bike were all of these empty beer cans. And in the beer cans were lots of plants, herbs and some perennials and flowering plants. And what they did, these guys who were basically, and a girl who were like hipsters, really, I suppose, they drove around on this bike to all of the Fringe projects and gave out these beer cans with plants in them to anyone who wanted them. They were really cool. And they got onto the cover of the Evening Standard, I remember, because they looked so great as well. And so that was an example of something I had no idea what at any point what that was going to be like until I actually saw it. And that's the sort of joy of it, really.
So a lot of very high wire acts then. So
yeah, but surprising.
To see those two, Fukuoka and Nagoya in Japan. What did they involve?
Well, they did a whole range of things. Again, I mean, they did a. I can't remember if it was in Nagoya or Fukuoka because I get them muddled up in my mind now because they last did the Fringe about 3 years ago. But they had, the idea of a community garden in Japan doesn't exist in the same way as here. So there were several community gardens were made actually on private land. There were essentially people who had really big gardens near a road or, a place the public can get to them. And they basically converted part of their own garden into a community garden. So just introducing that concept. I think the wildest thing they did in Japan was one group got a truck. And they made this garden on the truck and they drove it around the streets of, again, Fukuoka or Nagoya. I can't remember which one it was now, but they drove it around the streets and parked it at various places, all the while playing incredibly loud, like death metal music for reasons I never fully understood. But that was what they were doing. But there were lots of beautiful, in Japan, as you can imagine as well, beautiful ceramics and very delicate and beautifully poised, and there were some floral events and so on, beautifully poised events. And this year we always have cities joining pretty much every year, new cities, and this year Turin in Italy has joined.
Oh, great.
Yeah, so they're doing quite a lot of events in the Fringe. I think they've got 7.
Wow, that's good. That's good. So, what are there any this year that you can highlight, that you can point out that as particularly unusual or ambitious?
Well, there's a lot this year of events which are workshops, and there's quite a lot actually on dyeing. We noticed that there are often trends. A few years ago, there's a lot on bees, and then a few years before that, it was all about botanical cocktails. For some reason, everyone wanted to.
Oh, so you mean dyeing in the sense of dyeing clothes?
Pigments, yes.
Not dyeing. I thought you were going down the very morbid route then. Okay.
No, I mean DYE.
All right. Okay. Good. That's a relief.
Yeah, there's quite a lot. So I'm going on Saturday morning when the Fringe opens to the workshop of shibori, which is a Japanese. Well, what we would call it is tie-dye, but it doesn't come out looking like 60s sort of tie-dye. It comes out looking beautiful and Japanese. So I'm doing a 3-hour workshop on that at King Henry's Walk Garden in Islington. And I'm doing another one, actually, another kind of inky one. Well, it's making your own inks from, these are all from plants, obviously, down at Doddington Place Garden in Kent. Which is a really interesting garden in its own right. So that we have places which have always supported us for a long time. Amicia Oldfield down there, who's a really good gardener, runs these events there. So I'm doing a workshop on making inks there. And there's also really good events this year at somewhere called Omved, which is a place in Highgate in North London, which is a former nursery, and then it was abandoned, and then it was bought up, and has been turned into a kind of arts centre, which really only functions during the Chelsea Fringe period, a little bit before and a little bit afterwards, but the kind of core of its activities are for the Chelsea Fringe, really. And they always do the most beautiful events there. So there's lots of ceramics exhibition on there, and various concerts and food events and so on. They have a whole smorgasbord. So you can find that, all those events on the Chelsea Fringe website, all their own. They've got their own website. It's OMVED, and they do really nice.
Right. And where do you see the Fringe going in the next sort of 5 to 10 years, Tim? Have you got any plans for it, or you just sort of see what happens each year? I mean, have you any ideas of expanding?
Well, we don't really do a lot of directing of it. We don't have these strategies and kind of corporate style expansion ideas, as I say, because it's quite hard to think like that, to sort of not think in that way, because we're so used to in the world everything having to expand all the time and make money and all the rest of it.
It's quite liberating to do it like this way, isn't it?
It is, but as I say, it's difficult also to think like that, because we're almost brainwashed not to. So I think that what the Fringe does is provide this forum and in a way reflects what's out there. We're not really in a position to steer things. The events that come into the Fringe, provide a snapshot, as Chelsea Flower Show does too in its own way, provide a snapshot of the way people are thinking about gardens and about the planet more generally, I would say. I also think that it's becoming, and has always been actually, an activist project, the Chelsea Fringe. I think of the Fringe in its entirety, not only as an activist project, but also as a massive community art project in its own way. But I think that what we're doing, and really one of the reasons I wanted to set it up, was I was really inspired by what I was seeing at the time, particularly the guerrilla gardener Richard Reynolds at Elephant and Castle, who I met just before. This was buzzing in my head when the Fringe idea came into my mind, and I was very inspired by what Richard was doing at Elephant and Castle, this quite combative guerrilla gardening in the face of opposition from Southwark Council. And then really wonderful, the Bankside Open Spaces Trust. I wrote an article on that, way back in, whenever it was, 2006 or something like this, and about their wonderful little spaces down there that they'd made. And again, it had very much a community garden vibe. And I'm a writer and an organizer, I guess, and I thought the way that I could contribute to this world wasn't really by making my own community garden. I don't think I'd be very good at that, but was by, creating this platform and this way to celebrate and encourage actually all of this activity. Yeah, so I do look at the Chelsea Fringe. There's an awful lot of top-down stuff. Obviously, world governments and so on have to have their targets and emissions being reduced, and all of that is necessary. And it's not like the Fringe is sort of an alternative exactly, but it's a complement, I think. And the reason it's a complement is because these are very authentic, these activities and these events. These are events which are made by volunteers, often in their local area, for nothing. And in many ways, they're acts of love, I think, to the local populace, to the land on which people live and the locality in which they live, especially if it's an urban area.
Tim, have you thought about doing a book about the Fringe? Bringing it all together and with the two strands of your work. Has that crossed your mind?
I wouldn't want to write it myself particularly.
No.
No, I don't. I'm not really. No, I don't look upon it in that way. I mean, I come on this, and I'm the face of the Fringe, and I founded it. But I have been working with the volunteers on the Fringe for 12 years or longer now. And hundreds of people have come through, and have still got some people who've been there all the way through. And one thing I really didn't expect was the amazing kind of friendships I've made, and or acquaintances, often really, with people who come back, sometimes do the Fringe 1 year, not for 5 years, then come back again. And it's absolutely brilliant. And I didn't kind of quite anticipate that. So, there's a really good volunteer team behind it all. So I didn't really want to, it's already too associated with me as an individual, really.
Right.
So you asked the question of where it should go. I really want someone else to take it on. I've been doing it for 12 years. I mean, it's a great joy, especially at this time of year, but it's not good for a festival to be run by the same person and identified like that. The only problem is there's no salary attached to it. It's quite difficult to ask, but you know, I that's what I would like to see. I'm definitely not clinging to this for dear life at all. You know, I really want somebody else to come on and develop it, really, because it's a good place. It can run it. You know, if we can get the volunteers and retain volunteers, that isn't easy always, but you know, if you do that, the model works. We're not going to close down. The Fringe could carry on for a long time.
Yeah.
I mean, this is an interesting and a brave model you've chosen of not going for sponsorship. But I mean, given that you would like to hand over to somebody else, and that other people might feel that sponsorship actually, or at least some little bit of fundraising, does give you some sort of central basis from which a new person to take over and promote. I'm sure it would be kind of culture change, but is that not something you've considered?
Yeah, that's right. Somebody new coming in. Sorry, you broke up a little bit during that.
I was just thinking, if somebody, to get somebody new involved, you actually have to break some of your core principles and create something more of a structure and try and get some funding. So I think it would be very it's a really brave thing to do, to take over something where there is simply so little central organization, and particularly no kind of financial base to support publicity and those things that do have to be paid for.
Well, we do have a little bit of that. So we do have our income each year from Fringe events, and we do have things like website and tech support, a little bit of press support as well, and admin support. So there are small amount of people who do that, what I call semi-voluntary.
Right.
The only trouble is, and we do, you say it's not organised, that the opposite is true, Noel. In order to make this work, the revolution has to be organised,
Yes.
I thought you were a proper,
revolutionary.
You know that. The reason it works is that we're incredibly organised. We're not. The event itself has an anarchic and free feel. In order for that to happen, we are incredibly organised. We have minuted, meetings. Everything is actually done in a very kind of strict way, in the sort of best sort of revolutionary traditions, if you like. And the website actually, the website works. So in that sense, the only thing that we don't do is pay salaries. But the problem, you raise this idea of fundraising, and we started doing. I was obsessed with fundraising in the first years of the Fringe. I thought the Fringe wouldn't last for more than 2 years if we didn't have a big sponsor. But I then realised that most sponsors only hang around for 2, possibly 3 years. And so many events I've seen, including Fringe festivals, get a sponsor, then they have a whole infrastructure in place and paid people, and then they lose that sponsorship. And we all know how difficult it is to get that sort of funding. And then you're saddled with all of these outgoings, and the whole thing collapses. So it struck me that it was really a good model, actually, not to depend on that funding, because otherwise you just end up chasing all the time. You get into you have to employ a paid fundraiser, in order to get funding, and they're quite expensive. I think that if we can, it doesn't actually take all that much volunteer time to do the Fringe. And what I do, it doesn't. It did in the early years. It was about a quarter of a job for the first 3-4 years, I'd say. But that's been done. And we have a website which was actually paid for by the Valerie Finnis Trust. We applied for a grant for it, and they gave us the money for an entire website. And that is our infrastructure. And so that means that the volunteers can go on that, and it works smoothly, and everything, the Fringe can happen.
And Tim, over from your experience over the last 12, 13 years, what do you think is the most surprising element of being at the head of the Fringe? What is it that has surprised you, or taken?
Well, I think it's got to be the people, you know, actually come across all the different people I've come across and all of the different characters. I mean, in Fringe Week, I mean, the Fringe initially was 3 weeks long, just utterly mad. But that I didn't have the imagination, obviously, to think beyond the Edinburgh Fringe Festival, which is 3 weeks long. So it's 3 weeks, and I go around every single day to Fringe events for that entire period. So I'll be doing that for the 9 days of the Fringe from Saturday, and that's just such a joy time because I'm sort of going around, well, London, but not just London. I've even been out of the country once or twice to see Fringe events. You know, and going to visit all of these people. So it's that, and also particularly in a city like London, going to bits of the city where I think places like community gardens are or artist studios, and there's so many little pockets of it you've never seen, and it's actually a surprising joy to be wandering around, you know, on like a Wednesday afternoon in some postcode that you didn't even know existed, and discovering the city anew, and it's So I think that so people and the geography.
Where would you, or who would you like to do something that hasn't happened yet? Where would you really like the Fringe to, Fringe events to pop up? And obviously you can't do that much. You're limiting yourself and going out there and encouraging and evangelizing. But where would you just love to see events pop up? And we're thinking global here.
Well, I mean, I'd love to see it go as global as possible. We haven't had that much in America, funnily enough.
That's what I was thinking. This seems to be very little US input, and yes, I think some of the wacky Portland, Oregon types might want to do something. So
I did. I was up in Seattle and around there and talking to them, and they got very excited about it. And I do talks, on Zoom usually now. To an American audience about it, and there are always people who get excited. But the thing is to make a hub of Fringe events in a city, it does need an organizer. There needs to be somebody who's willing to step up, and that is a bit of a scary thing to do. I mean, there are people who do it. I mean, Seattle, as I mentioned, Seattle, they have done it for the last 2 years, not this year, but that's because the organizer can't this year. I think she'll come back next year. So it's very delicate in a way and fragile, the Fringe, because it depends on individuals. But, again, part of our ethos is not to badger people and ask them to do it again and again, is to actually just see what happens a little bit. I like it when Fringe events happen. I like it when they happen anywhere, but I like it when they happen at museums, actually, because I'd like to see more. The Jeffrey Museum, or the Museum of the Home as it is now, has been one of our greatest supporters and did every single year of the Fringe for I think the first 10 years, and then they had to close for refurb, and they still did events so they have been, I think the Jeffrey / Museum of the Home is the one who's done every single Fringe, the only one, but other ones like the Horniman Museum, the Natural History Museum have done it, but I'd like to see, I can't see why all museums can't do something in the Fringe in a way. It's a slightly mad, messianic kind of quest, and I genuinely thought when I started the Fringe that why shouldn't there be like thousands of events all over Britain? Big mad notion, but the fact there are even 100 is good news, I think.
Well, we should open up and invite some questions. We've actually had some comments from Lois Moss, who's actually over from Oregon, and is watching this presentation from the garden of a pub in Winchcombe, and says it's very interesting. I don't know, Lois, if it's not too noisy there, do you want to actually talk about your comments that you've made, if you're still watching?
I am still watching. And
hello, Lois. Hello.
I did something similar in Ohio, Cleveland, Ohio, that was closing streets to cars. I don't know if they do it in London or not, but it's called Ciclovia, or summer streets. And I can't even imagine what you've done with the Fringe. Just the little bit that I did it for 5 years, and it was much more complicated than people realize. So the whole nonprofit world in America, like, they won't do anything unless they have funding for it. It was a weird thing. I thought nonprofit was all kumbaya, but it's actually not very kumbaya at all.
No.
That is strange, isn't it? Because you'd think that places like Portland and Seattle and New York, you know, you'd think they'd be well up for doing something. And Philadelphia, actually.
Yeah.
Well, so some places are. There is a culture difference, and you know, I think it's brilliant in Britain actually that we have this sort of healthy disregard for the authorities, and it actually didn't even occur to me to ask permission to set up the Chelsea Fringe. And most people who do things in the Fringe don't. I mean, if it's not on public land, if it's on private land, you can pretty much do it. You know, you have to make sure it's safe and all the rest of it. But I've really noticed in Europe, people who do Fringe festivals, the Fringe in Europe, you know, I had to go when Florence did it. I had to go to Florence and present to the city, you know, to the civil servants in charge of Florence, because my friends in Florence who were going to do the Fringe could not conceive of doing it without asking permission, and just thought it was madness even to think of it. So, you know, I think we're very lucky actually in Britain that we don't have this kind of veneration of bureaucracy that you get in some other places.
Yeah. Now I noticed Katie Merrington, you're listening from Wakefield. I don't know if you want to say anything, or is there anything happening up north? Have you got anything happening at the Hepworth? I mean, I don't know if are you there? Hi, Katie.
Hello.
Hi.
Yeah, I'm from the Hepworth Wakefield. We're a museum. We should do something one day.
Yes.
Yeah, thank you, Tim. It's really interesting to hear this background, and I was struck that a lot of the activities and the Fringe events have a comedic element or a playfulness. And I always think as children we use gardens for play, but as adults in the UK, gardening is quite serious business. Like at Chelsea, it's quite serious, isn't it? Have you got?
Yeah. That's
Well,
really
I suppose Tim's conceptual gardens, I mean, some of them introduced that kind of playful element, didn't they?
Yeah, they did. Yeah. And humor. I've always been drawn to designers like Martha Schwartz who use humor in gardens. It's quite a rare thing in certain 18th century gardens as well. Yeah. You have humor. But thank you, Katie. That is a very, very good point about what the Fringe provides. This, because we want it to be quirky. That's the word we often use, maybe overuse, but that's the word. And I guess quirky has got an element, hasn't it, of sort of jokiness about it. And there, as you've seen from those shots which are going on the revolving presentation in the background, like the flower dog, you know, which one of these an artist made with sweet peas to make a dog. And in fact, we have a dog. We've had very successful dog shows in the Fringe. And a dog is not a plant, but the dogs are decorated with floral headpieces and then you see. So there definitely, absolutely is this kind of I think it's a really good point that we stop having, you know, if we're not careful, we can stop having fun in gardens. So as adults tend to sort of drink a lot in gardens. That's the adult version of going drinking their Prosecco or whatever. But we don't encourage that actually in the Fringe. We're because we don't have events, very many events, which you'd call children events, you know, because we don't particularly encourage that as a kind of a ring-fenced idea. But yeah, we most Fringe festivals you see thrive on alcohol. Actually, that's how they actually make their money. And we discovered that we went in the first year of the Fringe to something called the World Fringe Congress, which is being held at the Edinburgh Festival.
Oh no.
Yeah, so me and Mary, one of my key compadres on the Fringe, went up, and we met all these Fringe festivals from around the world, many of which actually were not really Fringe festivals, I would say, because they commissioned and curated everything, and in some cases were funded by the city, particularly the North American ones, and they weren't a Fringe of anything. They were using the Fringe as a sort of as a word to mean funky and interesting. So they weren't a Fringe to anything. And then we were there and they said to us, what comedians are you going to have then at your festival, your Fringe? And we said, well, we're not. We're having like plants and stuff like that and gardens. And anyway, what we learned over the presentations there were that it was really bar sales and beer which kind of kept these places afloat.
It's like with gardens. When anyone who opens their garden to the public will tell you that they make the money on the teas. Tea and cakes.
Yeah.
And the cakes, yeah.
Yeah, that's true. But again, we didn't want to have any model where you had to. I mean, the one I sometimes look at the National Garden Scheme, and I just think that this is such obviously an amazing thing, and the amount of money those gardens in the Yellow Book. I've got it here on my desk. I'm looking at it now, the handbook for this year. It's such an inspiring and wonderful thing, and they do that there. They're making the money for the charity, obviously, selling cakes and plants and all of it. And yeah, I have sometimes I've thought, is the Fringe sort of doing enough? Should we try to do that by earning more, making it into more something like that? But in a funny way, I think actually what we provide is a different sort of a service. As I say, it's the way of often community gardens, all year they exist, and particularly if they're in a housing estate, say, some of the people living very close don't feel that it's their territory, and they never go in there. And you come across people who've lived overlooking a community garden for a decade and have never set foot inside. And it's because they feel that it isn't theirs. And I know what the Fringe can do, an event like the Fringe, but there aren't very many events like the Fringe. So in this case, we're talking about this one. It can essentially give a formal invitation to people to enter in these spaces and then actually communicate with the people who are making the garden, who can explain to them what's going on. So it's sort of they get given permission, if you like. And I think that's a very sort of precious thing to do. I mean, it can be, the politicians call it social cohesion, but I think really just making friends, and again, because it has this ring of authenticity about it, it's so much more valuable, I think, that kind of interaction than something that's fostered by the Mayor of London or some county council, some region, borough council or something, where it's also buttoned up somehow. So I've seen that happen on numerous occasions, those sorts of interactions happening.
So Tim, so Saturday is the first day of the Fringe, is that right?
Yeah, that's the first day, yeah.
And is there an official sort of, ribbon cutting, launching, smashing a champagne bottle off a tree, or no? Like that?
We deliberately don't have anything like that. We don't have any prizes. We really try not to, when we're talking to the press about the Fringe, we try to big up as the person who's doing something in their front garden as much as, say, the History Museum. No, so we don't do any ribbon cutting. We don't have any formal anything. We have tried to have closing parties of the Fringe for the volunteers in the past, but they've sort of been disasters, really, I think, because only a few people turn up. Because people who volunteer for things don't want to be given things. So if you give them something like a party, they don't actually want it because of the sort of people they give.
Yeah,
it's true. It's a mindset. So it's really hard. We did have a really good party actually in our first year, a good opening party and end party, but that was just that there was a lot of buzz around it. So so the last day of the Fringe, I go to the last event, and if I'm with another kind of Fringe compadre or two, we might go to the pub and raise a glass to it in a very quiet way. But that's not the point. The weird thing about volunteering on the Fringe is the closer you get to the event, the actual Fringe happening, you enter this strange zone of incapacity. Because there's not much more you can do. We've done our work. It's February, March. We do all our kind of hardest work, if you like, then. And when the Fringe is almost upon us, we had a meeting this week just before our sort of general meeting for the people in the Fringe at the Garden Museum. And I only scheduled half an hour for it because I didn't know what we were going to talk about. We couldn't really think of very much other than certain press things that we wanted to do that we needed to do. So it's a really nice time. I always think of the Fringe itself as the time when me and the other people who are working on it can actually go to the events, and that's our reward. Really.
And before we let you go, so the website is chelseafringe.com. Yeah, simple. And a non-Fringe related, what are you working on in terms of book wise at the moment?
I'm working on a book about the 18th century English landscape garden, which is the topic of that book Noel held up earlier. But that's quite a sort of a kind of wordy book about the politics. But this is a book I'm writing where I'm going to try to communicate what is really wonderful about these gardens, because these gardens were what got me really into gardens in the first place. So it's 20 gardens telling a kind of narrative tale, I suppose, from Rest Park in around 1700 up to Hawkstone Park and the picturesque at the end of the century.
Right.
Just trying to 20 gardens explained with beautiful pictures by Clive Borsnell. So there hasn't been, oddly, a big book on the English landscape garden for years, decades.
Right.
Really strange.
Yeah.
But you know, Nicholas Pevsner, the famous architectural historian, he did the Buildings of England series and so on. Pevsners, as they're called. I mean, he said that the English landscape garden was Britain's major contribution to the arts, along with perpendicular Gothic architecture.
Yeah.
They were the two things that came out of this country to influence the rest of the world. So,
and when is publication date for that? When's your deadline?
well, my deadline is the end of this year, really, December.
Right.
So I get I'm out in summer next year, probably.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
But that's the big project I'm working on.
Good luck with it. Sounds
good. That's good.
Worthwhile project. Yeah.
Well, thanks, Tim, and just sort of to say welcome to the UK, Lois, and have a fantastic time at Chelsea, and try and see some Fringe events. And Katie, you've got to do something up at the Hepworth next year.
Yes.
Or is it too late to not do something this year? You could do something spontaneous.
We're doing something, aren't we, in September?
You are? Okay. Well, we're doing something with you in October, in fact. But now I'm thinking for the Fringe.
Oh yeah. I'll have a think.
Have a think. See what you can get together. Anyway, Tim, thank you very much.
Thank you, Tim. Thank you.
And congratulations on it's just such a brilliant thing, and it's really, you know, the way it's gone on and on from year to year, and it's so surprising and international as well. It's brilliant. Well done.
Oh, thanks for having me. Thanks so much.
That's all right. Well, enjoy it. I hope you get to enjoy it.
I will.